Australia provide a fifth of all revenue to the higher education sector. Tensions on campus have increased since solidarity campaigns for pro-democracy protests in Hong Kong sprang up. Colourful post-it notes scrawled with messages of hope and defiance, which are known as Lenin walls, have bloomed on campuses across the country, including at UTS where Professor Fung teaches. Keen to see it, I asked if he could show me.
I prefer not to go there. Okay.
That's okay. Is that you prefer not to go because it's still a site of trouble?
Because now the security guards against to make trouble with Chinese students. I don't want to confront them in that way.
Sorry, can you just say, do you know where the Lenin wall is or was? Yeah, cool. All right. No, that's right. I went to see what remained of the wall myself, but I had a bit of trouble finding it. The original post-it notes had been torn down, and the university chose to move the Lenin wall to an official place inside. Two security guards sat underneath an empty pinboard. Hi, how are you guys? I come to see the Lenin wall, but is this what's left of it? Finished. Right. What happened?
Sorry. You can't, spend comments, on things like that.
Well, these two kept the peace at UTS. Violence has flared at other campuses around the country. The first incident was at the University of Queensland in July.
So the big standoff happened here.
This is Drew Pavlou, who led a series of protests on campus. We stood under a sandstone archway right in the middle of the university. It's a busy thoroughfare, cafe on one side, a huge lawn in front of us, and a smaller courtyard behind, and there are students everywhere. He tells me that he chose this spot because on market day, it would be the best place on campus to hold a sit-in.
There were about 30 of us. I was sitting down, literally in this spot, just with the megaphone, leading a chant against Xi Jinping. And was surrounded by at least 150 nationalists, I think. Several, pro-CCP men, some of them in masks, came over. This huge Aussie guy in a sweatshirt and sunglasses came over, just ripped the megaphone from the hand, threw it to the ground, shattered it.
In the videos he sent me, Drew stands suddenly and pushes the man who smashed the megaphone.
I was punched in the side of the mouth, I was punched in the ribs, thrown to the ground, and they were just surrounding us, and they had the boom speaker playing the national anthem. And a man in a Tokyo Ghoul mask, teeth across the mask, he came up behind me and knocked me in the back of my head while my back was turned.
What do you know about who these people were? Were they students? Where did they come from?
So that's the thing. We know that the Chinese Student Scholar Association on campus has links with the consulate, and so we wonder, did the consulate direct the students that are part of the Chinese Student Scholar Association to confront us at the rally? And additionally to that, the 3 to 4 men who were violent on that day, the men wearing masks who had taken steps to conceal their identities, they seem to be there with the sole purpose of sowing discord, disrupting things, attacking people.
Drew blames at least some of what has happened to him on China's most senior diplomat in Queensland.
I received dozens of death threats online after Zhu Ji, the Consul General in Brisbane, labelled me a separatist and said I was engaging in anti-China activities, and he endorsed the patriotic behaviour of the students who attacked me. Those were his words, patriotic.
Drew is now suing China's Consul General in Queensland, saying his words incited the death threats. So far, Zhu Ji hasn't attended court and is claiming diplomatic immunity. The Chinese Students and Scholars Association at the University of Queensland didn't get back to me. Members from other branches have previously confirmed that the embassy provided flags, transport and food for students attending a rally to welcome the Chinese Premier to Australia. I did speak to somebody from the branch at the University of Sydney to ask about links to the embassy.
Hello.
Nice to meet you.
Thanks for making time. I know it's exam week.
We meet one evening on campus. Amy is friendly.
So my name is Amy, and I am the Director of Chinese-Australian Relationship Department, and I just got elected last week.
And she assures me that the Students' Association's only function is to provide social and practical support to Chinese students.
Our society is not providing anything political to students. We're just providing support to Chinese students here in Australia. If you want to involve in anything political, you stand for your own self, not for Chinese students, not for the embassy, not for Chinese, no.
So you heard of that happening, of the embassy not necessarily forcing people to go, obviously, because they can't do that, but encouraging people to go?
No, I've never heard, and none of my friends have ever heard anything about that. The embassy is not making us do anything, and we are not doing anything.
But does it ever worry you receiving funding from the embassy?
We don't have to do what they tell us to do, because we are not relying on their funding. They are just sponsoring us, and yeah, we are our own dependent association. We do our own choices.
The thing is, the Chinese Students and Scholars Association is political. Founded in the student movement in China in 1989, it was soon co-opted by the party and is now an official arm of the United Front Work Department. Still, Amy insists she's not told what to do or say.
I mean, Australia is a country of freedom comparing to China. It's your own choice. It's people's own choice. You can't label the whole Chinese international students crowd. You can't do that because basically it's a big population. We have the freedom to do everything we like here.
Which might be exactly the problem the Chinese Students and Scholars Association seeks to solve.
I'm from mainland China. I used to be a hardcore nationalist.
Vicky Shu came to Australia to study, but says halfway through her degree, something started to change.
I was very, very overwhelmed. Growing up, my entire life, all I knew was, China has been bullied by the West. China is seeking to return to its rightful place, the superpower. And when my education in the West questioned all these things that I knew as facts, it shook my belief system, and I could not cope well with it. At first, I was very, very defensive.
Vicky is now a researcher with the defence think tank in Australia, focusing on China, and she also works as a comedian and journalist.
My job is to write about and research on China-related issues in an objective manner. The problem is the Chinese government isn't interested in anyone doing that. They just want anyone, who's a Chinese citizen or who's of Chinese heritage to follow the party lines and also actively promote the party lines. So when you fail to do that, especially as a Chinese person, the consequences are, in the past months, the Chinese media, they're just having a go. I've been targeted online. They're calling me a traitor, a whore, a West-worshipping dog. That's all a campaign of punishment because I broke the patriotic code.
And Vicky says it's clear that while some of that nationalism is genuinely felt, there's also direction from the embassy and, by extension, the Chinese Communist Party.
These trends of toxic Chinese popular nationalism are not getting enough attention, and they're not seen as a problem because, people are worried. If we criticize them, are we racist?
I mean, Australia does have a really long history of anti-Chinese racism dating back to the 1800s. Do you think that is a factor in the current discussion? Is there an element of paranoia that is racialized?
I mean, I don't think any of my reporting or research work on Chinese nationalism has come from a place where, I'm racist against my own people. I mean, Australia does have, as you said, does have a long history of racism, and I feel it pretty regularly. That is a problem. But the discussion about Chinese interference campaigns and the discussion about toxic popular Chinese nationalism are not because of race. That is also sort of buying the Chinese Communist Party talk points, right? Whenever Australia passes a law or says anything about Chinese interference, the Chinese authorities go, that is Cold War mentality. You are hurting the feelings of Chinese people. Whatever criticism towards the government is criticism towards the people.
But Chinese Australians are increasingly under that spotlight. Take Gladys Liu. She's a Liberal Party MP from Melbourne and the first Chinese-born person to be elected to the House of Representatives. Clive Hamilton, the author of that book about United Front Work,
Ms. Liu not only had close links and in fact had various positions like honorary president and advisor and positions like that with United Front organisations in Australia, she was also a member of United Front organisations in China.
Ms. Liu initially said she didn't remember being part of these organisations and in one case was signed up without her knowledge or permission. Against the background of clashes between Chinese students and supporters of the Hong Kong protesters around the country, with fake Chinese police cars showing up in 2 state capitals, and a corruption inquiry hearing about bags of cash from Chinese businessmen linked to the CCP, Gladys Liu's ties to United Front organisations seemed like just one more thing to add to the folder marked Chinese state interference in Australia. But there are those who say that membership of groups like the Chinese Students and Scholars Associations or the business groups that Gladys Liu was part of is nothing to be alarmed about. David Brophy is a professor at Sydney University where his research is focused on Xinjiang, and he's been involved in campus meetings between mainland Chinese and Hong Kong students.
Every diaspora community in Australia has organisations like this that maintain connections to the homeland, that take advantage of business opportunities, that they as members of this diaspora are in a particularly strong position to take advantage of. And clearly doing so would bring these organisations at some point into contact with Chinese officialdom and the Chinese Communist Party. But to say that someone who simply appears on a membership list or part of the leadership body of this organisation is therefore suspect of being disloyal and entering Parliament in order to pursue a foreign country's political agenda, I felt that that was a massive stretch. That may not necessarily be motivated by racism, but it will have racist consequences in discouraging people of Chinese heritage in Australia from fully participating in public life, because they know that upon entering into politics, they're likely to face this type of continuous and unfair scrutiny.
Professor Brophy is probably a difficult one for the Chinese state to categorise. He's doing research on Xinjiang, which would normally have him labelled unfriendly.
I also teach on Tibet. I've brought Uyghur dissidents to the Sydney University campus.
But he's suspicious of the narrative about Chinese state interference in Australia, fearing it tips into paranoia. He's been trying to build bridges.
I was involved in helping to organise an event at Sydney University which was just called Let's Talk About Hong Kong. And this was intended deliberately as outreach to the Chinese student population on campus. It was advertised in Chinese. It was conducted mostly in Chinese. So the meeting was held in the evening on a weekday. There was about 60 to 70 people present. There was a degree of nervousness going into the meeting. Part of the reason that I was involved as a faculty member was to, mitigate the possibility of any kind of disruption. And in fact, the 2 speakers, initially at least, they wore masks as well to conceal their identities. One of them actually discarded it halfway through the meeting. But you can see from that people were nervous.
But ultimately, Professor Brophy says that the work the Chinese government does overseas is not that different to that of other countries.
Look, China has its lobbyists, it has front groups, it has its objectives. I think China is primarily interested in preventing Australia being used as a base by groups within the diaspora that it identifies as its political enemies. Beyond that, China clearly is interested in cultivating good relations with Australian politicians. But having said all that, I would insist that I don't think that the correct response here is that we must therefore gear up for a confrontation with China, that we must become more militaristic, that we must become more nationalistic, that we should also treat our minorities as potentially subversive elements, just as China does.
Professor Brophy is of the view that there may now be more smoke than fire when it comes to the extent of Chinese state influence in Australia. And that we should be wary of our own security services inflating that threat. It's difficult to say where the line is. What about Nick Zhao, the Melbourne car dealer who turned up dead in a hotel room after he told security services he'd been recruited to run for Parliament by a Chinese spy? It turns out he was already in custody at the time candidates were being selected. But ASIO, in a rare public confirmation, says they are investigating his claims. And the way China watchers interpret his story depends entirely on the level of threat they see. He was either a small-time crook, nothing to do with the Chinese state, who decided that going to the security services would get him out of a fraud trial. Or it could show the Chinese Communist Party attempting to infiltrate Australian politics, but doing it in a ham-fisted manner. Or it's a rare and alarming insight into the influence operations of the Chinese state.
This is the BBC World Service, keeping you updated.
I think this week we're going to see a further increase.
COVID-19 is a global pandemic.
We don't know how many people are affected by it.
Hundreds of countries are affected, and many thousands of lives have been lost.
A widely available vaccine is thought to be 12 to 18 months away.
Get the latest on the coronavirus outbreak here on the BBC World Service.
This is the BBC World Service. Our light news season continues with Fraser and Henry exploring the upside of ADHD. I've always known that I'm different.
If I have any superpower, this is the superpower.
A few months ago, I was diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD.
The illness of having your laptop open but with 20 tabs on your browser, it's difficult sometimes to focus on the one thing.
It's challenging, but I prefer it that way. It's actually an overabundance of attention. So it's the opposite of having a deficit. I'm going to struggle with the cognition and find out if there is a more